ballroom of the Grand Wellington Hotel looked like something from a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like glowing diamonds, and soft golden lights covered every corner of the room. Round tables filled the hall, dressed in white silk cloth with tall flower arrangements standing proudly in the center. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of fresh food and sweet desserts. A live band played quietly near the stage while guests laughed, drank, and celebrated one of the biggest weddings the city had seen that year. Almost everyone inside the ballroom came from wealthy families. Men in expensive suits stood around discussing business deals while women in sparkling dresses took photos beside the giant wedding cake. The bride and groom moved from table to table, smiling for pictures and greeting hundreds of guests. But while everyone enjoyed the celebration, very few people noticed the hotel workers moving silently around the room. One of them was a young waitress named Evelyn. She wore the same black and white uniform as the other servers, her hair tied neatly behind her head. All evening, she carried trays of drinks, cleared empty plates, and quietly moved between tables without drawing attention to herself. Unlike the other workers who chatted whenever they had a free moment, Evelyn mostly stayed silent. There was something calm about her, something different. Every now and then, while passing near the stage, her eyes drifted toward the grand piano sitting beneath the lights. It was a beautiful black piano with smooth shining edges. Earlier in the evening, a professional pianist had been entertaining the guests with soft romantic music while they ate dinner. But after nearly 2 hours of non-stop playing, the older musician suddenly looked pale and weak. A few minutes later, hotel management quietly escorted him backstage. Soon the music stopped completely. First, nobody cared. The guests were too busy talking loudly and enjoying themselves. But after several minutes of silence, people slowly began noticing the missing music. Conversations became awkward without the soft piano in the background. Near the center of the ballroom sat a loud table of wealthy businessmen who had clearly been drinking since the reception started. The loudest among them was a man named Clifton. He loved attention more than anything. Every joke he made came with a booming laugh, even when nobody else found it funny. Throughout the evening, he had been mocking waiters, snapping fingers at workers, and acting as if the entire hotel existed only to serve him. As Evelyn passed by carrying a tray of empty glasses, Clifton noticed her glancing once more toward the piano. A smirk spread across his face. "Well, look at that," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Seems like the waitress misses the music." Several people at his table laughed. Evelyn lowered her eyes politely and continued walking, hoping to ignore him. But Clifton wasn't finished. "Maybe you can play for us," he shouted jokingly. More laughter followed. A few guests turned their heads curiously toward Evelyn, expecting her to smile awkwardly and walk away. Instead, she paused for just a second. "It's been a long time," she answered softly. Clifton leaned back in his chair dramatically. "Oh, so she does play." His friends burst into louder laughter. One woman sitting nearby looked uncomfortable. "Leave her alone," she whispered to him. But Clifton only grinned wider. No, he said. "Tonight is about entertainment." The musician disappeared, and now we've discovered hidden talent among the staff. Evelyn tried to continue working, but Clifton stood from his chair. "Come on," he called out. "Play something for the happy couple." People around the ballroom began paying attention now. Some guests smiled with curiosity, while others simply waited to see what would happen next. The bride noticed the growing commotion and walked closer with the groom beside her. "What's happening?" she asked. Clifton pointed toward Evelyn. "Your waitress here claims she can play piano." Evelyn immediately shook her head. "I didn't say that." "You said it's been a long time," Clifton replied. "That means you know how." The bride gave Evelyn a gentle smile. Unlike Clifton, she didn't seem cruel or mocking. "You really play?" she asked kindly. Evelyn hesitated. "A little," she answered quietly. Clifton clapped his hands together. "Perfect. Problem solved." The groom looked uncertain. "We don't want to pressure anyone." But now many guests had become interested. Some encouraged her politely while others only wanted a laugh. Phones slowly appeared as people prepared to record what they expected would be a funny moment. Evelyn's cheeks turned red with embarrassment. "I'm working," she said softly. One older woman near the front suddenly spoke kindly. "Just one song, dear. It might be fun." The room waited. Evelyn looked toward the piano again. For a brief moment, her expression changed completely. The nervous waitress disappeared, replaced by someone carrying memories too heavy to explain. Then the moment passed. She slowly handed her tray to another server. The ballroom grew quieter as she walked toward the stage. Clifton smirked confidently and crossed his arms, clearly expecting disaster. "Here we go," he muttered to his friends. Evelyn reached the piano bench and stopped. Up close, the piano looked even more beautiful beneath the warm lights. Her fingers hovered slightly above the keys without touching them. The entire ballroom watched her. Some guests whispered jokes. Others simply looked curious. A hotel manager near the back looked nervous, probably worried the wedding entertainment was about to become a complete embarrassment. Evelyn sat down carefully. For several seconds, she didn't move at all. Then she closed her eyes. The ballroom became strangely silent. Even Clifton stopped talking. Finally, Evelyn placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes were soft, gentle, simple, but within seconds the room changed. The sound flowing from the piano didn't sound hesitant or amateur. It sounded beautiful, rich, emotional. Conversations stopped instantly. Guests slowly turned in their chairs. The soft melody floated through the ballroom like warm light, wrapping around every table and every corner of the room. People who had been laughing moments earlier now stared silently toward the stage. Evelyn's fingers moved gracefully across the piano as if they belonged there. The nervous waitress was gone. In her place sat someone completely different. Her posture straightened naturally. Her movements became confident and smooth. Every note carried emotion so deep that even strangers could feel it. The bride covered her mouth in shock. The groom blinked several times, unable to believe what he was hearing. Even the hotel workers stood frozen near the kitchen doors. Clifton's smirk slowly disappeared. "This can't be real," one of his friends whispered. But it was real. Very real. The melody grew stronger, filling the ballroom with a powerful emotion nobody expected to feel that night. Some guests stopped recording because they became too focused on listening. One elderly man sitting near the stage leaned forward suddenly. His eyes widened with recognition. He stared at Evelyn carefully, almost as if he had seen a ghost. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued playing without looking at the audience. It was as if the world around her had disappeared. The piano became the only thing that existed. Every note sounded alive. Every movement carried years of hidden emotion. The guests who originally expected a joke now sat completely silent. One woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Another guest whispered, "She plays better than the original pianist." Clifton shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time that evening, he looked small. The song slowly built toward a breathtaking finish. The final notes echoed softly through the ballroom before fading into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For 2 full seconds, the room stayed frozen. Then suddenly the ballroom exploded with applause. People stood from their chairs cheering loudly. Some guests whistled. Others clapped so hard their hands hurt. The bride looked emotional as she walked closer to the stage. Evelyn immediately looked uncomfortable again, almost surprised by the reaction. She stood from the piano quickly, as if she wanted to disappear before anyone could stop her. But the elderly man near the front had already risen from his seat, and the expression on his face showed clear shock. He kept staring at Evelyn while the applause continued around them. Then quietly, almost to himself, he whispered words that would soon change the entire night. "I know her." The applause continued long after the music ended. Guests who had barely noticed Evelyn earlier were now standing beside their tables clapping loudly. Some even looked at each other in disbelief, as if they still could not understand how a quiet waitress had just delivered such an incredible performance. Evelyn stepped away from the piano carefully, keeping her eyes low. The attention clearly made her uncomfortable. She gave a small polite smile toward the bride and groom, then quietly tried to move away from the stage. But people immediately surrounded her. That was unbelievable. Where did you learn to play like that? You have to play another song. Phones pointed toward her from every direction. Some guests were already replaying recordings they had captured during the performance. Clifton remained frozen near his table. A few minutes earlier, he had expected the room to laugh at Evelyn. Now the entire ballroom was praising her while he sat there looking embarrassed. One of his own friends leaned toward him quietly. "You picked the wrong person to mock tonight," he whispered. Clifton forced a laugh, trying to act unaffected. "Well, anyone can learn a few songs," he muttered. But even he no longer sounded confident. Near the stage, the elderly man who had recognized Evelyn slowly walked closer. His face carried a mixture of shock and curiosity. He studied her carefully while the crowd continued speaking around them. Finally, he spoke. "Excuse me," he said gently. Evelyn turned toward him. For a moment, she looked nervous again. The man gave a respectful smile. "I knew I recognized you." Evelyn's expression changed instantly. It was small, almost impossible to notice, but there was something in her eyes that looked worried. "I think you may have mistaken me for someone else," she replied softly. The older man shook his head immediately. "No," he said firmly. "I never forget talent like that." The bride and groom stood nearby listening carefully. The man extended his hand politely. "My name is Theodore Bennett." Several guests nearby reacted quietly when they heard his name. Some clearly recognized him. Theodore had once been a well-known music professor and concert judge. For years, he had worked with some of the most respected musicians in the country. Evelyn hesitated before shaking his hand. "You played at the Crescent Hall competition years ago," Theodore continued. "I remember because the audience stood before you even finished your final piece." The ballroom suddenly became quieter around them. Some guests moved closer to listen. Evelyn looked uncomfortable. "That was a long time ago." "So it is you," Theodore said softly. Clifton frowned from across the room. "Wait, she was some kind of professional?" Theodore slowly turned toward him. "Some kind," he repeated. "Young lady. Years ago she was one of the most gifted pianists I had ever seen." A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. The bride looked stunned. "Seriously?" Theodore nodded. "She performed in major competitions before most people her age even finished college." Everyone stared at Evelyn differently now. Not as a waitress, not as background staff, but as someone carrying a story nobody knew. Evelyn quietly looked down at her hands. The bride stepped closer kindly. "Why did you stop?" For a second, Evelyn didn't answer. The ballroom had become strangely calm again. Even the hotel workers stood still nearby, pretending to clean while secretly listening. Finally, Evelyn gave a small shrug. "Life happened," she said quietly. But Theodore could tell there was much more behind those words. "You disappeared suddenly," he said carefully. "Many people wondered what happened to you." Evelyn looked away toward the piano. "I had other responsibilities," she answered. Her voice remained calm, but there was sadness hidden underneath it. The bride gently touched her arm. "You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to." Evelyn gave her a grateful smile, but Theodore spoke again. "Your mother," he said softly. "Wasn't she ill around that time?" Evelyn's eyes lifted slowly. The room became completely silent. After a long pause, she nodded once. "Yes." Theodore's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Evelyn crossed her arms lightly, almost as if protecting herself from the attention. "She got sick very suddenly," she explained. "At first I thought I could manage both things. The competitions, concerts, traveling, and taking care of her." She gave a faint sad smile. But eventually something had to be left behind. Nobody interrupted her. Not even Clifton. "The treatments became expensive," Evelyn continued, "and she needed someone with her almost all the time." One guest quietly lowered her phone after hearing that. Another guest who had been recording stopped completely. The room no longer felt curious in an excited way. Now it felt personal. Human. I stopped performing little by little, Evelyn said. Then after some time, I stopped playing at all. Theodore looked genuinely heartbroken hearing this. You were extraordinary, he said softly. Evelyn smiled politely, though sadness remained in her eyes. That was another life. The bride looked emotional now. I can't believe you've been working here this whole time. Evelyn gave a small shrug. Work is work. Clifton shifted awkwardly in his chair. For the first time that evening, guilt started appearing on his face. One of the hotel servers standing nearby quietly whispered to another worker. She never told anyone. The second server nodded. Not once. Meanwhile, Theodore still looked amazed. How long has it been since you last played publicly? He asked. Evelyn thought for a moment. Almost 8 years. Several guests gasped quietly. And tonight you played like that after 8 years? Theodore asked. Evelyn looked embarrassed by the compliment. I'm rusty, she replied softly. That statement made several people laugh gently in disbelief. Even the groom smiled. If that's rusty, I don't know what talent looks like. The atmosphere in the ballroom had completely changed now. Earlier, people had treated Evelyn like invisible staff. Now guests spoke to her with warmth and respect. The bride suddenly had an idea. You should play one more song, she said. The crowd immediately agreed. Yes, please. One more. Evelyn quickly shook her head. No, really, I should get back to work. But the bride smiled warmly. Tonight is my wedding. I think I'm allowed one request. The room laughed softly. Evelyn looked trapped between embarrassment and kindness. Before she could answer, Clifton suddenly stood up again. People immediately glanced toward him. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally apologize. Instead, he forced a grin and said loudly, Well, if she really used to be famous, then one song doesn't prove much. Several guests frowned. The bride looked annoyed instantly. Clifton. But he continued speaking. I'm just saying, maybe she memorized that piece years ago. He shrugged carelessly. Real musicians can play anything. Theodore's expression hardened. You should stop talking, one guest muttered quietly, but Clifton ignored him. What? He said defensively. I'm complimenting her. No, Theodore replied calmly. You're trying to protect your pride. A few guests nodded. Clifton laughed awkwardly. Come on. Everyone's acting like she's some legend. Theodore looked toward Evelyn, then back at Clifton. All right, he said calmly. Let's settle this. The room became quiet again. Theodore pointed toward the piano. Play something requested by the guests. Several people exchanged excited looks. Clifton crossed his arms. Exactly. Theodore continued. Not a prepared piece. Something random. Now all eyes returned to Evelyn. She immediately looked nervous again. No, she said softly. I really can't. You can, Theodore replied kindly. You're just afraid. That sentence hit deeper than anyone expected. Evelyn stayed silent. The bride stepped closer. Only if you want to. For several long seconds, Evelyn stared at the piano across the ballroom. Memories clearly moved through her mind. The bright stage lights. The pressure. The years she had tried to leave behind. Part of her wanted to walk away immediately. But another part of her, the part hidden deep inside for years, still missed the music. Guests waited quietly. Nobody laughed now. Nobody mocked her. They simply wanted to hear her play again. Finally, Evelyn let out a slow breath. Then she looked toward Theodore. What kind of song? She asked quietly. A slow smile appeared on Theodore's face. And across the ballroom, Clifton's confident expression finally began to fade. The ballroom stayed silent as everyone waited for Evelyn's answer. She stood near the piano with dozens of eyes focused on her. Just minutes earlier, most people in the room had barely noticed her existence. Now nobody wanted to look away. Theodore gave her an encouraging smile. Anything is fine, he said gently. We only want to hear you play. Evelyn glanced around the ballroom nervously. The attention still made her uncomfortable. Years ago, large audiences had once been normal for her. But now, after so much time away from music, standing in front of people again felt strange. Very strange. The bride stepped closer. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said kindly. Evelyn appreciated that. But before she could answer, one younger guest near the back raised his hand jokingly. "Can she play jazz?" Another guest laughed. "What about old movie songs?" Someone else called out, "Try classical." Soon people began shouting different requests from every direction. The room slowly filled with energy again. Clifton leaned against his chair with crossed arms, pretending to look relaxed, but his expression showed growing tension. He had expected Evelyn to fail earlier. Instead, she had completely changed the mood of the entire wedding. Now he desperately wanted proof that her first performance had simply been luck. Theodore noticed him watching carefully. Then he looked back toward Evelyn. "You don't need to play a perfect concert," he said quietly enough for only her to hear. "Just trust yourself." Evelyn took a slow breath. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the piano keys. Then something inside her finally softened. "Okay," she whispered. The guests immediately cheered. Evelyn sat down once more at the piano bench while conversations slowly faded again. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the black piano surface. Cameras rose into the air as more people prepared to record. One hotel worker near the kitchen whispered nervously, "This is insane." Another worker nodded. "I still can't believe she works here." At the piano, Evelyn flexed her fingers slowly. The truth was, she was nervous. The first performance had come from pure emotion. She had closed her eyes and allowed old memories to guide her hands naturally. But this was different. Now everyone expected something extraordinary. That pressure scared her. She hadn't felt this kind of fear in years. Theodore sensed her hesitation immediately. "You still hear the music in your head, don't you?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked at him for a second, then gave the smallest nod. Theodore smiled warmly. "That means it never left you." Those words stayed with her. Never left you. For years, Evelyn had convinced herself that her music career belonged to another version of herself. Someone younger, stronger, someone who existed before hospitals, bills, exhaustion, and loss entered her life. But sitting at the piano again brought back feelings she thought had disappeared forever. The room became completely quiet. Then Evelyn began to play. This time, the melody started differently. Not soft and emotional like before. Instead, her fingers moved quickly and confidently across the keys with surprising energy. A playful jazz rhythm suddenly filled the ballroom, causing several guests to smile in shock. People looked at each other immediately. "She can play jazz too?" The melody shifted again almost instantly into a smooth romantic tune from an old film. Some older guests recognized it immediately and began smiling with nostalgia. Then suddenly, without warning, Evelyn blended the tune into a powerful classical arrangement. Gasps spread through the crowd. Her hands moved faster now, beautifully, effortlessly. It no longer looked like someone remembering old practice. It looked like someone born for music. The bride stared with wide eyes while holding her husband's hand tightly. "This is unreal," he whispered. Clifton's expression grew worse with every passing second. The guests who had once laughed beside him now ignored him completely, too focused on Evelyn's performance. Meanwhile, Theodore stood near the stage with visible pride in his eyes. He remembered the first time he had seen Evelyn years earlier at a youth music competition. Even back then, she had carried something special. Not just skill, emotion. Most talented musicians could play notes correctly. Very few could make people feel something. Evelyn always could. And tonight proved she still could. The music shifted once more. Now she blended multiple requests together as if the songs had always belonged side by side. Classical music melted naturally into jazz. Jazz transformed into modern melodies. Modern melodies drifted back into emotional piano harmonies that filled the ballroom like waves. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. One woman quietly wiped tears from her face again. A little girl sitting beside her mother stared at Evelyn with complete admiration. Even the hotel manager looked emotional now. Near the back of the room, several workers secretly recorded the performance on their phones. One whispered, "People online are going to go crazy when they see this." Another nodded quickly. One recording captured Clifton sitting silently with a completely defeated expression, while the ballroom applauded during the middle of the performance. The irony of the situation was impossible to ignore. The man who mocked Evelyn had accidentally revealed her gift to the entire room. As the performance continued, Evelyn slowly stopped looking nervous. Something was changing inside her. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing became calmer. For the first time in years, she looked truly alive. Not tired. Not invisible. Alive. The piano no longer felt like a painful memory. Felt like home. And somewhere deep inside, that realization scared her almost as much as it comforted her. The final section of the performance became softer again. More emotional. Every note seemed filled with years of silence, sacrifice, and hidden pain. The ballroom listened carefully, completely captured by the honesty in her music. When the final note finally faded into silence, nobody reacted immediately. The room stayed still for a moment, almost as if nobody wanted the music to end. Then the applause exploded louder than before. Guests rose from their seats again. Some even shouted proudly. The bride was crying openly now while laughing at herself for getting emotional. "That was the best part of the entire wedding," she admitted. Her husband smiled. "Not even close." Evelyn stood slowly from the piano, breathing deeply. The applause continued around her, but this time something felt different. Earlier, she wanted to run away from the attention. Now she simply looked overwhelmed. In a good way. Several guests rushed toward the stage again, praising her performance. But before the crowd could fully surround her, a woman near the front stepped forward calmly. Unlike many guests, she had remained mostly silent all evening. She looked elegant and composed, probably in her late 50s, wearing a dark green evening dress with silver jewelry. Theodore immediately recognized her. "Well," he said quietly with surprise, "this just became interesting." The woman smiled faintly as she approached Evelyn. "My name is Vivian Laurent," she said politely. A few guests nearby reacted instantly. Even Clifton looked surprised now. Vivian Laurent was known for supporting young musicians and funding major arts programs across the country. Her foundation had helped launch countless careers over the years. Evelyn looked confused. "Nice to meet you." Vivian studied her carefully. "You have remarkable talent," she said honestly. "Thank you," Evelyn replied softly. Vivian glanced toward Theodore. "You were right." Theodore smiled proudly. "I told you." Now the surrounding guests became even more curious. Vivian turned back toward Evelyn. "I organize a charity concert every year," she explained. "We invite gifted musicians from different backgrounds to perform. Important people attend. Critics attend. Sponsors attend." Evelyn immediately looked nervous again. Vivian continued calmly, "I would like you to audition." The crowd reacted with excitement. But Evelyn's face changed completely. Fear returned instantly. "No," she answered quickly. Vivian blinked in surprise. "No, I can't," Evelyn said softly. "You absolutely can," Theodore replied. But Evelyn shook her head again. "You don't understand." Vivian crossed her arms gently, not offended, only curious. "Then help me understand." Evelyn looked toward the piano again. For a moment, she seemed lost somewhere far away. Then she finally spoke quietly. "I'm not that person anymore." The room grew silent once again. Vivian stepped closer carefully. "Talent like yours doesn't disappear." Evelyn gave a faint sad smile. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But people change." Theodore looked at her with deep understanding. "Yes," he said softly. "But sometimes they only forget who they are." Those words hit Evelyn harder than she expected. For a second, emotion appeared clearly in her eyes. She looked away quickly before anyone noticed. Meanwhile, guests continued whispering excitedly around the ballroom. Some already talked about posting the videos online. Others wondered how someone so talented could disappear for years and end up working quietly as a waitress. Clifton remained silent through all of it. For once in his life, he had no clever joke. No sarcastic comment. Only regret. And while the ballroom buzzed with excitement around her, Evelyn stood near the piano feeling something she had not allowed herself to feel in many years. Hope. The ballroom remained crowded around Evelyn long after her second performance ended. Guests who had originally planned to leave early were now staying near the stage, talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. Some replayed videos on their phones while others argued over which part of her performance had been the most impressive. But Evelyn herself looked overwhelmed by all the attention. For years, she had lived quietly, avoiding conversations about music whenever possible. Most people at the hotel only knew her as the calm waitress who always arrived early and never complained. Now strangers were suddenly treating her like someone extraordinary. It didn't feel real. Vivian stood nearby speaking quietly with Theodore while occasionally glancing toward Evelyn. "She still has it," Vivian said softly. Theodore smiled. "I told you from the beginning. But something is holding her back." Theodore's expression became thoughtful. Pain usually does. Across the ballroom, the bride approached Evelyn again holding 2 glasses of water. "You probably need this," she said kindly. Evelyn laughed softly for the first time that evening. "Thank you." The bride handed her a glass and leaned against the piano nearby. "I'm serious," she said. "Tonight feels unreal." Evelyn shook her head modestly. "It's your wedding. People will remember that." The bride smiled knowingly. "They'll remember the wedding because of you." Evelyn immediately looked embarrassed again. Before she could respond, the groom suddenly joined them carrying his phone. "You might want to see this." Evelyn frowned slightly. "See what?" He turned the screen toward her. It was a video of her first piano performance. The recording already had thousands of views online. Evelyn's eyes widened. "What?" The groom laughed softly. "One of the guests uploaded it less than an hour ago." Comments were flooding in rapidly beneath the video. "Who is she? This gave me chills. She plays with so much emotion. Someone find this pianist." More notifications appeared every second. Evelyn looked stunned. "That's impossible," she whispered. The bride smiled. "Apparently not." Nearby guests were already discussing it excitedly. "She's going viral. My sister just texted me asking about the piano woman. I saw 3 different uploads already." Evelyn slowly handed the phone back, looking unsettled. For most people, sudden attention might have felt exciting. For her, it felt frightening. Vivian noticed the worry on her face immediately. "You don't like publicity," Vivian observed calmly. Evelyn gave a nervous smile. "Not really." Vivian folded her arms gently. "That may become difficult after tonight." Evelyn looked down quietly. The truth was, part of her wanted to disappear before things became bigger. Before questions started. Before people expected more from her. Theodore sensed exactly what she was thinking. "You're considering running away again," he said softly. Evelyn looked at him in surprise. "You make it sound dramatic." "Because it is," Theodore replied. Vivian nodded slightly in agreement. "You spent years hiding from your talent," Vivian said. "But eventually life has a way of bringing people back to what they were meant to do." Evelyn sighed quietly. "It's not that simple." Vivian looked directly at her. "Then explain it." For a moment, Evelyn stayed silent. The ballroom noise continued around them, but their small conversations suddenly felt separate from everything else. Finally, Evelyn spoke honestly. "When my mother got sick, music stopped feeling important," she said quietly. "Competitions, concerts, interviews. All of it felt meaningless compared to taking care of her." Neither Vivian nor Theodore interrupted. "She used to tell me not to give up performing," Evelyn continued. "But every time I sat at the piano I felt guilty, like I was spending time on the wrong thing." Her voice remained calm, but the emotion underneath it was impossible to miss. "After she passed away," Evelyn said softly, "I couldn't touch the piano anymore without thinking about her. The bride looked emotional again, listening nearby. Evelyn gave a faint smile filled with sadness. So I stopped. Theodore lowered his eyes for a moment. I wish someone had helped you carry that burden, he said quietly. Evelyn shrugged gently. Everyone has their own problems. Vivian studied her carefully. You know, she said, some people spend their entire lives searching for purpose. Evelyn looked confused. Vivian continued, you already found yours years ago. You just convinced yourself you didn't deserve it anymore. Those words hit hard. Evelyn looked away immediately. Before the conversation could continue, one of the hotel staff hurried toward her nervously. Evelyn, the worker whispered, the manager wants to see you. Evelyn instantly looked worried. What happened? I don't know, the worker admitted. But he's asking for you. Clifton overheard the conversation nearby and smirked slightly. For the first time all evening, he looked hopeful again. Maybe the hotel doesn't appreciate employees turning weddings into concerts, he muttered quietly. The bride immediately shot him an angry look. Please stop talking. Clifton raised his hands defensively. I'm just saying. Evelyn took a nervous breath and followed the staff member toward the back hallway of the hotel. The excitement of the ballroom slowly faded behind her as she walked through the quieter service corridors. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. Maybe Clifton was right. Maybe management was angry. Maybe they thought she had crossed a line by becoming the center of attention during such an expensive event. When she finally reached the manager's office, the door was already open. The hotel manager stood inside holding a tablet in his hands. He looked serious. Evelyn immediately apologized. I'm sorry if I caused any problems tonight. The manager blinked in surprise. Problems? Evelyn nodded nervously. I know I wasn't supposed to leave work during the event. Evelyn, he interrupted gently, sit down. That only made her more nervous. Slowly, she sat across from his desk. The manager turned the tablet toward her. More videos, more comments, millions of views now across multiple uploads. News pages had already started reposting clips from the wedding. One headline read, Wedding guests shocked after waitress reveals incredible hidden talent. Another said, Mystery pianist leaves luxury wedding speechless. Evelyn stared at the screen in disbelief. This happened in one night? The manager nodded slowly. I've worked in hotels for 20 years, he said. I've never seen anything like this. Evelyn looked overwhelmed again. I'm sorry, she whispered automatically. The manager suddenly laughed softly. You keep apologizing for the wrong things. She looked confused. Instead of criticizing her, the manager leaned back in his chair with a smile. Half the guests extended their bookings because of tonight, he admitted. And the bride's family personally thanked the hotel for what happened. Evelyn blinked several times. You're not angry? Angry? He shook his head. Honestly, everyone downstairs is proud of you. That surprised her more than anything else. The manager's expression softened. You've worked here 3 years, he said. You never ask for attention. You help everyone. You cover extra shifts when people are sick. He smiled faintly. You deserve something good happening to you. For a second, Evelyn felt emotional hearing that. Then the manager continued. Also, he hesitated. You may want to prepare yourself. Prepare for what? He lifted the tablet again. Reporters are already trying to contact the hotel. Evelyn's eyes widened immediately. No, I'm serious. Her face paled slightly. No, no, no. The manager laughed gently at her panic. You don't have to speak to anyone tonight, he assured her. But this story is spreading fast. Evelyn covered her forehead with one hand. This was exactly what she feared. Tension, questions, publicity. She had spent years avoiding all of it. Now it was arriving all at once. Back in the ballroom, Theodore and Vivian remained deep in conversation. She's terrified, Theodore said quietly. Vivian nodded. Because this changes everything. Theodore looked toward the hallway where Evelyn had disappeared. She believes she lost her place in the music world. Vivian smiled thoughtfully. Maybe the world simply waited for her to come back. Meanwhile, Clifton sat alone at his table staring at the videos online. The comments were brutal. Imagine mocking someone this talented. That man at the table looks ridiculous now. He treated her terribly. One video even zoomed directly onto Clifton's stunned face during Evelyn's performance. His embarrassment grew worse by the minute. For the first time in years, he truly understood what it felt like to become the joke in the room. And he hated it. A while later, Evelyn finally returned to the ballroom. The moment guests noticed her, applause started again. She looked shocked. Several people walked over asking for photos. Others congratulated her warmly. The little girl from earlier approached shyly holding a napkin and pen. "Can I have your autograph?" Evelyn stared at her in complete disbelief. "My autograph?" The little girl nodded excitedly. "You're my favorite pianist now." Those simple words nearly broke something inside Evelyn. For years, she believed people had forgotten her completely. Now a child who met her only an hour earlier looked at her with pure admiration. Evelyn signed the napkin gently. The little girl smiled proudly before running back to her family. Vivian watched the moment carefully. Then she stepped toward Evelyn one final time before leaving. "The audition invitation still stands," she said calmly. Evelyn hesitated. Vivian handed her a business card. "Think carefully before saying no again." Then she smiled softly and added, "Some opportunities only knock once." As Vivian walked away through the ballroom crowd, Evelyn stood frozen holding the card in her hands. And deep inside her heart, the walls she had spent years building were finally beginning to crack. The days after the wedding felt unreal to Evelyn. By the next morning, videos of her piano performance had spread everywhere online. People shared clips across social media with captions calling her the mysterious waitress pianist and the forgotten musician who shocked an entire wedding. Millions of people watched the videos. Some cried while listening to her music. Others became obsessed with finding out who she really was. Former music students posted old competition clips from years earlier, comparing the young concert pianist from the past to the quiet waitress from the wedding. News pages picked up the story quickly. Soon her face appeared everywhere. Even people at the grocery store recognized her. First, Evelyn tried ignoring everything. She kept working at the hotel and avoided reading comments online. But it became harder every day. Guests constantly stopped her in the lobby asking for photos. Reporters waited outside the building hoping for interviews. Some hotel workers loved the excitement. Others treated her differently now. Not badly, just differently. Suddenly people wanted to know her opinions. They invited her to lunch breaks. They asked about her past. Everyone seemed fascinated by her story. But inside, Evelyn still felt confused. One evening after work, she sat alone in her small apartment staring at Vivian's business card, resting on the kitchen table. She had carried it in her pocket for days without calling. Part of her wanted to throw it away and return to normal life. But another part of her kept remembering the feeling of sitting at the piano again. The music, the emotion, the strange feeling of finally breathing after years underwater. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn opened the apartment door and looked surprised. Theodore stood there holding a paper bag. "You never answer your phone," he said with a smile. Evelyn laughed softly. "I didn't know you even had my address. The hotel manager gave it to me after I promised not to act creepy." That made her laugh again. Theodore stepped inside carefully while looking around the small apartment. The place was simple but warm. A few framed family photos sat near the window. Books were stacked neatly beside the couch. Then Theodore noticed something in the corner of the room. An old piano covered partly by a cloth. He looked at Evelyn quietly. "You kept one." Evelyn followed his gaze. "I almost sold it after my mother passed away," she admitted. "But I couldn't do it." Theodore nodded gently, understanding more than she realized. He handed her the paper bag. "I brought dinner because I assumed you forgot to eat again." Evelyn smiled gratefully. As they sat together eating simple takeout food, the conversation slowly became more personal. "You know," Theodore said carefully, "people don't stop talking about you. Evelyn groaned lightly. Please don't remind me. I'm serious, he continued. Music schools are discussing your videos. Concert halls are sharing your performances. That's exactly the problem. Theodore studied her face carefully. You're scared. Evelyn sighed deeply. Yes. Of what? She stayed quiet for a moment before answering honestly. What if the wedding was just one moment? She whispered. What if people expect too much now? Theodore shook his head immediately. Talent like yours doesn't disappear overnight. But confidence does, Evelyn replied softly. That answer stayed between them for several seconds. Finally, Theodore leaned back in his chair. Vivian called me earlier, he admitted. Evelyn instantly looked nervous. She's still interested? She's more than interested. She wants you at the charity concert. Evelyn rubbed her forehead tiredly. Theodore, listen to me, he interrupted gently. Opportunities like this rarely happen twice. Evelyn looked toward the covered piano in the corner. I don't know if I belong in that world anymore. Theodore's expression softened. You never stopped belonging there. Before Evelyn could respond, her phone suddenly vibrated on the table. A known number. She almost ignored it. But Theodore nodded toward the phone. Answer it. Evelyn hesitated before finally picking up. Hello. A familiar voice spoke nervously on the other end. Hi, it's Clifton. Evelyn blinked in surprise. Theodore raised an eyebrow curiously. For a second, neither person spoke. Then Clifton cleared his throat awkwardly. I know this is probably the last person you wanted calling. Evelyn stayed calm. What do you need? His voice sounded completely different from the wedding night. No arrogance. No fake confidence. Only discomfort. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Evelyn remained silent. Clifton continued speaking carefully. I acted terribly that night. Theodore listened quietly without interrupting. I thought humiliating people made me funny, Clifton admitted. I didn't realize how awful I sounded until I watched those videos afterward. Evelyn leaned against the kitchen counter listening. Clifton let out a slow breath. The truth is, seeing everyone admire you after the way I treated you made me ashamed of myself. For the first time since the wedding, he sounded genuinely honest. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Evelyn looked down at the floor for a second. Then she surprised both Clifton and Theodore with her answer. I forgive you. Clifton sounded shocked. You do? Yes. There was a long pause. Finally Clifton laughed weakly. You're kinder than I deserve. After the call ended, Theodore looked impressed. You handled that well. Evelyn shrugged lightly. People make mistakes. But not everyone admits them. Evelyn thought about that quietly. Maybe the wedding had changed more than just her life. Meanwhile online, interest in Evelyn continued growing every day. One famous musician reposted her performance calling it pure emotion. Another invited her publicly to collaborate. The pressure became overwhelming. Everywhere she looked, people expected something from her. Eventually, after several sleepless nights, Evelyn finally picked up Vivian's business card. Her hands trembled slightly before dialing the number. Vivian answered almost immediately. I was wondering how long it would take. Evelyn smiled nervously. You sound very confident. I recognize hesitation when I hear it. Evelyn sat quietly near the window while speaking softly into the phone. I still don't know if this is the right decision. Vivian's voice remained calm. That's normal. What if I fail? Vivian answered without hesitation. Then you fail. And life continues. That response caught Evelyn off guard. Vivian continued gently. People spend too much time waiting until fear disappears. It never does. Evelyn listened carefully. The brave ones simply move forward while afraid. For several seconds, Evelyn said nothing. Then finally she whispered, Okay. Vivian smiled through the phone. Good. Rehearsals begin Monday. The next week felt terrifying. The concert hall was far larger than anything Evelyn remembered. Musicians moved around confidently carrying instruments while staff prepared lighting and sound equipment. Everything felt professional. Serious. Real. The moment Evelyn entered the building, anxiety hit her hard. I shouldn't be here, she whispered quietly to herself. But Theodore walked beside her calmly. Yes, you should. Inside the rehearsal room, several musicians looked up curiously as Evelyn entered. Some recognized her instantly from the viral videos. Others whispered quietly. Evelyn suddenly felt exposed all over again. Vivian approached confidently. You came. Barely, Evelyn admitted nervously. Vivian smiled slightly. That's still progress. Rehearsals began slowly. At first Evelyn struggled badly. Her hands shook during difficult sections. She missed notes she normally would never miss. The pressure of performing in front of professionals after so many years became overwhelming. After one rough rehearsal, Evelyn sat alone backstage fighting tears of frustration. I knew this was a mistake, she whispered. Theodore sat beside her quietly. You're expecting perfection too quickly. I used to play better than this. You also used to practice 8 hours a day. That answer made her sigh. Vivian eventually joined them backstage. You know what your problem is? She asked calmly. Evelyn looked exhausted. There are probably several. Vivian smiled faintly. You're trying to play exactly like the person you used to be. Evelyn stayed quiet. But audiences don't connect to perfection, Vivian continued. They connect to truth. Those words stayed in Evelyn's mind long after rehearsal ended. That night, she returned home and sat alone at her old piano. For hours, she played quietly in the dark apartment. Not for fame, not for audiences, not for critics, just for herself. And little by little, the fear inside her began loosening its grip. Days later, the night of the charity concert finally arrived. The theater buzzed with excitement as wealthy donors, musicians, reporters, and guests filled the seats. Bright lights covered the stage while backstage performers prepared nervously. Evelyn stood behind the curtain staring at the massive audience. Her heart pounded violently. I can't do this, she whispered. But Theodore gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Yes, he said softly. You can. Then the stage announcer spoke her name. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Evelyn stepped onto a concert stage again. The bright stage lights almost blinded Evelyn as she walked toward the piano. The theater was completely full. Hundreds of people sat quietly in the audience waiting for her performance. Some recognized her from the viral wedding videos. Others came because they were curious about the mysterious pianist everyone had been talking about for weeks. Reporters sat near the front rows with cameras ready. Music critics whispered while flipping through concert programs. Backstage performers peeked through the curtains curiously. And in the center of the stage sat the grand piano waiting for her. For one frightening moment, Evelyn felt frozen. The pressure felt enormous. Her heart beat so hard she could hear it in her ears. Part of her wanted to turn around and run off the stage before anyone noticed. But then she looked toward the front row. Theodore sat there smiling calmly. Beside him sat Vivian, watching quietly with complete confidence. And suddenly Evelyn remembered something her mother once told her many years ago. Music is not about being perfect. It's about making people feel something real. That memory steadied her. Slowly, Evelyn sat down at the piano bench. The audience became completely silent. No whispers, no movement, only silence. Evelyn looked down at the keys. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she closed her eyes and took one slow breath. And finally, she began to play. The first notes sounded soft and fragile, almost like someone speaking carefully after years of silence. But within seconds, something changed. The nervousness slowly disappeared. The music took over. Her fingers moved naturally across the keys, carrying emotion that words could never fully explain. Every note sounded honest. Not forced. Not rehearsed for attention. Honest. The audience listened carefully. People who came expecting technical perfection quickly realized they were hearing something far more powerful. They were hearing a human story. Pain, loss, loneliness, hope, all hidden inside the music. Evelyn no longer noticed the audience watching her. The stage lights faded from her mind. The cameras disappeared. The fear disappeared too. For the first time in many years, she stopped fighting herself. The melody grew stronger. Some sections sounded emotional and heavy, while others carried warmth and peace. It felt almost like her entire life was unfolding through the piano. Several audience members quietly wiped tears from their eyes. One elderly man in the third row removed his glasses while staring at the stage emotionally. Even backstage workers stopped moving just to listen. Theodore smiled proudly without taking his eyes off Evelyn for even a second. Vivian leaned back softly in her chair, already knowing this moment would change everything. The performance continued building toward something bigger. Every difficult note flowed naturally. Every emotion felt real. Nothing about it sounded fake or overly polished. And that honesty reached people deeply. Halfway through the performance, Evelyn suddenly remembered sitting beside her mother years earlier in a small hospital room. Back then, she had promised herself she would never return to music after losing her, because returning meant reopening painful memories. But now, while sitting at the piano again, Evelyn realized something important. The music had never truly caused her pain. The silence had. Tears quietly filled her eyes while she continued playing. And somehow, that emotion only made the performance even more beautiful. In the audience, several people openly cried now. One young girl held her father's arm tightly while staring at the stage with admiration. Even the reporters stopped focusing on writing notes. They simply listened. Then came the final section of the piece. The melody softened again, becoming gentle and peaceful. Not sad, peaceful. Like someone finally finding their way home after being lost for years. Evelyn's fingers slowly moved across the last few notes. Then finally, silence. The final note faded through the theater. For one long second, nobody reacted. The entire room stayed completely still. And then suddenly the audience rose to its feet. The applause exploded across the theater louder than anything Evelyn had ever heard. People stood clapping, cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. Some shouted bravo. Others simply kept applauding without stopping. Evelyn sat frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by the reaction. She had dreamed about moments like this when she was younger, but somehow this felt more meaningful now, because this time she understood how easily dreams could disappear, and how special it was to find them again. Backstage musicians applauded her as she finally stood from the piano. Vivian smiled proudly while Theodore looked close to tears himself. The standing ovation continued for nearly 2 full minutes. When Evelyn finally walked backstage again, several performers immediately surrounded her. That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that. You made the whole audience emotional. Evelyn laughed softly through tears, still overwhelmed. Vivian approached calmly and handed her a glass of water. Well, she said with a small smile, I believe that answers your question. Evelyn looked confused. What question? Whether you still belong here. Evelyn smiled emotionally while lowering her eyes. For the first time in years, she finally believed the answer herself. Later that night, videos from the concert spread online even faster than the wedding clips had. News stations replayed sections of her performance. Music pages called it the comeback nobody expected. One headline read, Former piano prodigy returns after years away, leaves audience in tears. Another called her performance one of the most emotional concert moments of the year. But what mattered most to Evelyn wasn't fame. It wasn't headlines. It wasn't even the applause. It was the feeling inside her chest that had finally returned. Peace. Over the next several months, her life changed completely. Vivian offered her a permanent position working with young musicians through the Foundation's music program. Instead of chasing fame around the world, Evelyn chose something simpler. She began teaching, mentoring, helping talented young players who lacked confidence or opportunity. And surprisingly, she loved it. Many students connected with her immediately because she understood struggle better than most famous performers ever could. She taught them more than music. She taught them patience, strength, and the importance of not giving up on themselves. Meanwhile, the hotel where she once worked proudly displayed photos from the famous wedding performance near the lobby entrance. Guests constantly asked employees about the waitress pianist. The hotel manager loved telling the story every time. One afternoon nearly a year later, Evelyn received an invitation to attend another wedding at the same ballroom where everything had started. This time she wasn't invited as staff. She was invited as an honored guest. When she entered the ballroom again, memories flooded back instantly. The chandeliers, the piano, the stage. Everything looked almost exactly the same. But her life was completely different now. Several hotel workers rushed over happily to greet her. "You came. We're so proud of you. You have no idea how many people still talk about that night." Evelyn hugged several old co-workers warmly. Then her eyes noticed someone standing quietly near the back of the room. Clifton. For a brief second, both looked unsure. Then Clifton slowly walked toward her. Unlike before, there was no arrogance in his face. Only sincerity. "I almost didn't come tonight," he admitted awkwardly. Evelyn smiled politely. "Why?" He laughed weakly. "Because every time I see those wedding videos online, I remember how stupid I acted." Evelyn smiled softly. Clifton looked around the ballroom for a moment before speaking again. "You know," he said quietly, "that night changed me more than you probably realize." Evelyn listened calmly. "I spent years treating people like they mattered less than me," he admitted. "Then I watched someone I mocked become the most respected person in the room." He shook his head slightly. "That stayed with me." Evelyn could see he truly meant it. Clifton smiled faintly. "So, thank you." She looked surprised. "For what?" "For teaching me a lesson without trying to." For a moment, neither person spoke. Then soft music suddenly filled the ballroom speakers. Guests turned toward the stage where the grand piano still stood beneath the lights. The bride from the previous wedding walked over smiling brightly. "There's only one way this evening can be complete," she said playfully. The crowd immediately began applauding. Evelyn laughed softly while shaking her head. But deep down, she already knew she would say yes. A few moments later, she sat at the same piano once again. Only this time, nobody looked at her as an invisible waitress. Nobody mocked her. Nobody doubted her. They simply listened. And as Evelyn placed her fingers gently on the keys, a peaceful smile finally appeared across her face.